Good afternoon. I'm Tom Schatz, president of Citizens Against Government Waste, and I am here with Commissioner Brendan Carr of the Federal Communications Commission. Very happy to have you, Commissioner. We've talked a number of times in the past. Of course, most of that was when President Trump was in office. Now we have President Biden, and I think things might change. So let's talk about a number of issues: 5G, net neutrality, money being spent on broadband. But let's start with the work you've done. Been a great leader on promoting 5G across the country, climbing up towers with your emails and other information about your ventures, which has been great to see, to get out there and really understand what's happening. What do you think the FCC can do to keep this kind of work moving forward? And what do you see as barriers to deployment of 5G?
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity, Tom, to join you on this Facebook Live. Really appreciate all of the good work that your organization has been doing. The good news is I have a feeling that organizations like yours that stand against government waste are going to be fully employed for the next couple of months and years. So that's the good news. In fact, that pig in the background that I can see is going to be put to use. I know you usually give out these awards for people that waste money, and there's going to be plenty of opportunity for that, particularly on the broadband side, as I think we've started to see already with the announcement last week of President Biden's $100 billion broadband plan. But before we get into that, to your question about 5G, let's level set for a second. If you look back at 2015 and 2016, the US was falling behind our global counterparts. There was a real serious risk that we were going to cede global leadership in 5G, all of the jobs that brings, all the investment that means to our overseas competitors, including China. Back then, Deloitte put out a study that said that China was about to unleash a 5G tsunami and making it nearly impossible for the US to catch up. And the facts on the ground kind of supported those dire predictions. If you look at infrastructure builds in this country in 2015 and 2016, they had essentially flatlined. In 2016, we put up just 708 cell sites in this country. And if you flash forward to 2019, after we updated our infrastructure rules, that number jumped to over 46,000. That's a 65-fold increase. And the game plan that we put in place was modernizing infrastructure rules. We had so much red tape that was slowing down internet builds, permitting processes. And that's what we took head on, and it has really paid off. So the good news is we now have a leadership position in 5G, but now is not the time to sort of let up on the gas pedal. That's why I put out a plan that looks on the spectrum side and on the infrastructure side and puts out concrete ideas that we can get done this year to maintain and extend US leadership.
Well, hopefully everyone will take a look at that and move forward on it. Well, let's turn to some portion of the spectrum, 5.9 gigahertz, which the FCC unanimously decided last year should be split, with the upper 30 going to automotive communications and the lower 45 for unlicensed use. We've seen a proposal to the FCC, some communication to the FCC to undo that decision. Can you talk about that at this point? Is it an ongoing issue, or is it something that you can comment on now?
Yeah, look, if you don't like inefficient use of scarce government resources, then you're going to love the decision that we reached in the 5.9 gigahertz band. If you step back, this was a band that decades ago, the FCC had reserved for a particular type of technology to be used for automobile safety. And the reality is, despite years and years and years of work, that technology never took off. And so the FCC stepped up to the plate last year, and we opened up that band. So we both protected spectrum for auto safety, while at the same time opening up spectrum around it to be used for a wide variety of next-gen use cases, including Wi-Fi. And I think that was a really good decision. It received a fair amount of pushback, to be clear. Department of Transportation, automobile industry fought the FCC's decision every step of the way. And this is something I talked about in that spectrum speech that I referenced. A lot of people talk about how, if we can just get all the stakeholders together in the same room, if we can just talk about spectrum policy, put more process in place, we'll get to the solution. And all that is true to some extent. We should continue to talk to each other. But the reality is with spectrum policy these days is at the end of the day, the FCC has to make the decision. We have to go forward. And there's going to be incumbent stakeholders that don't want us to move forward. We saw that with the Department of Transportation. So I was glad that the FCC moved forward on a bipartisan basis over the objections of the Department of Transportation, rightfully so, to free up that spectrum. To your point, we've seen some suggestions that this administration is interested in backsliding, to go back to sort of the dated, wasteful approach of 5.9 that we had in place for decades. Secretary Buttigieg put forward the idea that he has concerns with our approach to 5.9. I think this is the first test of FCC leadership in 2021. Are we going to stick with the decision we made on a bipartisan basis, put 5.9 in the rearview mirror, say, no, we're not going to revisit that decision. We made the right call, stick by our engineers, and then look for other spectrum bands to free up? Or are we going to get caught relitigating this decision? I hope it's not the latter. And I think all of my FCC colleagues should be quick to speak up and say, we got it right. We're not going backwards on that band.
Well, I don't think they want to fight again. I mean, if the FCC was able to fight back against Secretary Chow, I would think Secretary Buttigieg would be a little easier. And I say that with all due respect to him. Secretary Chow is a formidable proponent of her agency's department's positions on many, many issues. So it was a tough fight. We were happy to help out, to say the least. Let's look now at what California has done with its net neutrality law. It's the only way to identify what they've done.
Yeah.
Department of Veterans Affairs immediately questioned whether they could continue to provide certain services because of how that law worked. AT&T said they weren't going to provide certain free services across the country because of California law. Can you talk about what this means in terms of, a ban on free data services, taking away something that was liked, and zero rating, and how that's harmful to consumers, and what, if anything, might happen as a result of what they did?
Yeah, this episode over the last couple of weeks is pretty troubling to me. And unfortunately, I think it's an omen of what's to come with these extreme net neutrality proposals that are out there. As you indicated, California passed their own net neutrality law a couple of years ago. The enforcement of it was stayed until just a week or two ago. Well, flash forward to less than 24 hours before that California law can become enforceable, and top level lawyers at the Biden Veterans Affairs Administration are scrambling to try to figure out whether that law is going to result in America's veterans getting cut off from free access to telehealth services, including mental health services. We shouldn't be in that situation where with hours to go, there's uncertainty. And from what I can tell from people that have looked at the California law, it's pretty clear that you can't continue to offer those free services. This falls into the bucket of what you described as zero rating, which means we still have a lot of Americans that are on plans that have data caps. And so to enable them to get access to telehealth services for free without running through their data, the VA entered into relationships with a number of carriers so that when people are using that app, including for video consultations, the data usage doesn't count against their data cap. That is a very much pro-consumer decision, and one that I think we should all support. Yet it was one that California's net neutrality law put directly in the crosshairs. And so I think that's a mistake. And so I think it just goes to show, while you can put great sounding language around these provisions like net neutrality, it ends up catching pro-consumer innovation. So I think that's a mistake. I don't know what the status is right now. I don't think California has provided clear guidance about where is it going to go with respect to these zero rated services. But I think it's a great example of the negative, either intended or unintended consequences that come from that extreme version of net neutrality.
Right. Well, of course, somebody has said, well, we didn't mean it, but you can't really say that about something that's clear in statutory language, and then other exceptions start getting made. And again, points to the flaws of this whole idea of strict regulation of internet service providers. And let's talk now about the federal aspect of net neutrality. It's not the first thing on the docket, but in part perhaps because it's still 2-2, but it, I think, seems likely this will come up. What do you think will happen? And I want people to understand what that means. This applies to the internet service providers. The FCC has jurisdiction over internet service providers. So they would be regulating this portion of the internet ecosystem. They would not be regulating content providers like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and others. Not that I'm suggesting that anyone has jurisdiction over all of this or that the FCC get additional jurisdiction, but what does the net neutrality or Title II regulation mean? What would it mean, and how did it work when it was in effect?
If we go back to 2017, when we proposed to eliminate the Obama era FCC's 2-year experiment with heavy-handed regulations, there were headlines out there saying end of the internet. There were Democrats in Congress saying that if the FCC goes forward with this, the internet will come to you at one word at a time. You had people like Banksy out there saying that you were going to be charged per tweet as a result. So the rhetoric obviously was way out there. So let's take a look at what happened. Since our decision over the last 3 or 4 years, internet speeds in the US have not slowed down. In fact, they have tripled. We have leapfrogged 20 other countries in terms of global mobile speed rankings. Infrastructure builds, as we talked about, have just been booming, both on the wireless side and on the wired side. Take fiber. About 450,000 route miles of new fiber were built out in 2019 alone. That was something like a 70% increase over 2016 levels. And all of that is, led to prices declining on wired and wireless and competition increasing. So this is one of the great success stories of the last 3 or 4 years, is by eliminating the over-regulation of internet providers, we helped enable this boom in infrastructure build. So that should be the game plan going forward. In fact, COVID-19 confirms this. This was a global black swan event. Almost overnight, families shifted their lives onto the internet, and that resulted in a massive spike in usage, 30% in some cases. And that may not sound like a lot, 30% more, but to put that in perspective, when you look at, as an engineer, the increase in traffic you're expecting to see on your network, that 30% is something you probably didn't plan to see until something like 2 or 3 years down the road. So you took 2 or 3 years worth of expected traffic growth and loaded it onto the network overnight, and yet America's infrastructure continued to perform. Mobile wireless speeds actually increased, and we didn't see any substantial reductions. Meanwhile, our friends abroad in Europe, where they have a much more heavily regulated system when it comes to internet providers, had problems. Their regulators asked Netflix to degrade their streaming quality, plus other streaming platforms as well, to prevent the continent's networks from breaking. So the idea that we would want our networks and our regulatory approach to look more like Europe's, I think, is misguided. And COVID-19 was the ultimate stress test for global telecom policies. The US approach worked, other countries didn't work as well.
Well, again, this might be an example of, if it was done in the last administration, we're just going to undo it even if it was successful. And let me correct myself. I didn't mean to insult the content providers by saying that they were Google, Facebook, Twitter. Those are edge providers. So I must correct myself on that.
Well, but I do think that point raises an interesting question. Again, I think the approach that we're have in place right now works, and we should stick with it. But if the theory of the case of heavily regulating the internet is that every single piece of data should be treated equally, that we need to go after the threats to a free and open internet, then that theory, propounded by a lot of Democrats, is one that doesn't take you to regulating the mom and pop ISP in Iowa, or at least it doesn't take you only there. It's an approach that says that we should look holistically at the internet ecosystem. Again, if you're concerned about a bit of data, well, then follow the life cycle of that bit of data from its creation to the end user. Look at all the infrastructure that touches that, including the cloud services. And I think if you're concerned about that, then you need to look at every single piece of that infrastructure stack and make sure that there are rules in place to prevent conduct that's going to discriminate against that bit of data. That's not my approach, but I think if your theory is one in which we need to police the gatekeepers that touch data, then I think that does take you towards the edge of the network.
Well, we'll deal with that with antitrust. That's a totally different issue. So let's talk for the rest of the time we have here on broadband. American Rescue Plan had $350 billion for state and local fiscal relief funds. The way that law is written, money can be used either for individuals and businesses and other services locally and through the state, or, there's a big or, infrastructure like water, sewer, broadband. So if somebody took that literally, they could spend $350 billion from that legislation solely on broadband. But they went further. And in the infrastructure, defined very loosely, proposal from President Biden, they have $94 billion in broadband with a lot of restrictions. For example, having a preference for government-owned or municipal broadband. I read somewhere that if you make profit, you make any kind of money, you can't get any of this money. It strikes me as, it's not really nationalizing 5G, but it is certainly, it also preempts any state laws, of which there are many, that prohibit cities and towns from creating their own broadband networks. So it is a complete reversal of everything that's been done successfully over the years. So that's one question, is what's going to happen with that? And then the other would be, the other question is really about the minimum 100 symmetrical upload download, but that's a separate part as well as a broadband. But let's talk about the rescue plan and the infrastructure plan first.
Yeah, well, I think your organization should have a field day rooting out the waste, fraud, and abuse that's going to take place as this Biden $100 billion broadband proposal works its way through the system. The proposal was met this week in DC and last week even with questions about whether, what does even constitute infrastructure? And I think there's been legitimate points made that the lion's share of what's in there doesn't even count under a broad definition of infrastructure. Now, in my view, that doesn't apply to broadband. I think that's the one part of the plan, the $100 billion broadband plan, that they're right, that is infrastructure. The problem there is the plan itself. And to your point, I think it's going to take us backwards when it comes to infrastructure builds, not forwards. One point that's not emphasized enough, I think, that your organization might be sympathetic to, is let's take stock of where we are right now. You mentioned some of the money that's already been spent. Last year at the FCC, we committed $9.2 billion to support high-speed internet builds to millions of Americans over 10 years. At the same time, we budgeted up to $11 billion for a second phase of that initiative. Earlier this year, we stood up a new $3.2 billion program to support low-income Americans. And just last month, Congress provided us with $7.1 billion to support distance learning. And that's on top of this 5G fund that we're gonna be rolling out, that's $9 billion. When you stop a second, there's at least $40 billion that the FCC has either voted on to spend or Congress has appropriated to us to spend for broadband. Here's the kicker: not one penny of that $40 billion tranche of funding has gone out the door, hasn't gone to support an internet build, hasn't gone into the pockets of a low-income American. And that's on top of, as you mentioned, the hundreds of billions of dollars that have gone to the Treasury Department and the Department of Education for a variety of projects, including broadband. So I think step one should be, let's make sure we administer those funds properly, because the $100 billion plan doesn't even account for that spending. And it doesn't even account for the millions of Americans that are going to get service because of that spending. So let's administer that money first, then let's take stock of the work that remains and tailor any legislation to that actual need. And then beyond the funding, there's some fundamental problems with the Biden broadband proposal, which looks like it tracks the $94 billion Internet for All bill that Democrat leaders introduced in Congress earlier. To your point, it would prioritize communities that already have high-speed internet and mark them to get the super fast, what's called future-proof connections of the future. And that does nothing to connect the millions of Americans that still have no service today. Those are the Americans that should be our priority. So there's a lot of problems with this Biden broadband proposal that hopefully can get corrected along the way. But first and foremost is let's administer the funds we have. Because look, if you have, if you're old like me and have lost your hairs at this point, you can remember back to 2008, after that recession, and Congress appropriated a then unprecedented $7 billion for broadband, including a portion of it for BTOP. And if we all remember back to those days, it was waste, fraud, and abuse flourishing. It was congressional hearings with vows of, never again, particularly on the overbuilding. And yet here we are, right at it again. So I think there's some problems here that hopefully can get worked out.
Well, we have written about it. Of course, we wrote about that stimulus money. Remember it well. Deb Collier, our Vice President for Policy and Government Affairs, continues to write about this, as do I. And, it is unfortunate that this is what they're doing, but Commissioner, it's not about achieving an objective. It's about spending the money. When they considered the first bill this year, the American Rescue Plan, there were amendments offered by Republicans to not spend any of the money before the $1 trillion that was still out there was spent, and they were all rejected. It was about accounting for that money, it's still there. So, we are in a logic-free zone. It's all about spending the money. It's not about getting things done the right way. So on top of all this, there is the 100-100 symmetrical speeds proposal, which Deb has also written about. And you talk about that a little bit, because right now it's 25 up, 3 down, but 100 up and down, in addition to what the infrastructure bill does, really prioritizes a single form of providing broadband, and that's fiber. So can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, this one's perplexing. So this 100-100 approach seems to be plucking one type of broadband technology and saying that's the only technology that's going to qualify going forward. And there's several problems with that. One, whatever anyone thinks of the existing definition of 25.3, which by the way is the broadband speed tier that I subscribe to at my home, that is enough today to do multiple simultaneous Zoom calls. But I'm not going to necessarily defend that, particular standard. I think there's reasonable debate that can be had, but 100-100 doesn't make any sense. You're taking a fiber-only solution and saying that we need to build fiber to 100% of the homes and businesses in this country. That's like, as a practical matter, you're going to have sort of cable internet service providers that are providing, really high-speed services today and say, you don't count. We're going to use taxpayer dollars to overbuild cable internet plan. And that's just not a good use of funds when there's so much of the country that doesn't have service at all. And right now we're at an interesting point in convergence of technology. You've got mobile 5G that's providing fiber-like speeds in many cases. You've got fixed wireless builds that are helping to close the digital divide. You have low Earth orbit satellite technology, Starlink being among them, that are able potentially to provide very efficient service to what would otherwise be high cost areas to serve. So the right approach is a balanced one that allows a range of technologies that meet, the sufficient definition to flourish. But, raising the standard such that only one technology works is a mistake, and it would just drive the cost of bridging the digital divide absolutely through the roof. So I don't think that's a good idea.
Right. It's also TV white space is another idea technology to reach people that are otherwise difficult to reach. But I live on Capitol Hill, and your office isn't that far away. So we live in an old brick house, 16-inch brick walls. There's an old school behind us that's a condominium where it's basically almost physically impossible to get fiber. Cable is there because it's been there, but you'd have to, put holes in the walls, and it would be at a high cost, even for a small building of about 30 apartments. So imagine this going across the country where you have to lay the fiber out into the miles and miles at last 2% or whatever it might be. Is extremely expensive. And then who pays for that? Oh, well, I guess if access to the internet is a basic right, the taxpayers will pay for it. It's just they're basically proposing. So we will be continuing to talk about this. Is there anything else you want to talk about in the few minutes we have left? I know we've taken a lot of your time, and I appreciate it.
No, that's hits the highlights. I think, I think there's a lot of great news that we can build on the successes of the last couple of years. I think we year, obviously a 3.45 megahertz auction we now have lined up for this year. That's great. We need to stick with that plan. Two, as I said, we should do an auction of 2.5 gigahertz spectrum this year. There's some additional progress in the 6 gigahertz band that we can make. I've laid all that out. And maps is going to be another important piece. We need to move very quickly to complete these broadband maps, because that's going to be the information that's going to tell us where do we direct additional funding. It's been said a lot inside this building that we need maps before money. And I'm concerned that the $100 billion Biden broadband plan is going to get out ahead of that and give us money before we have the maps to know where to direct it. So I've called for the FCC to get the maps done this fall. And I've said one way we can do that is by a targeted approach that focuses narrowly on the data we need to move forward with the 5G fund and RDOF phase 2. And I hope we're able to hit that, because any delay is going to delay the time that it takes to further bridge the digital divide.
And you brought up a good point. We're already bringing in money at no cost to the taxpayers through auctions. We did analysis last year, was over 120 billion. I know it's more than that now with all the new auctions, but to us, that is the way to fund new technology, reaching these areas that need to be connected, better connected, rather than just throwing something out there that not only takes money directly from the taxpayers, but also sets the wrong priorities. So there's always something to say about all of this. And we very much appreciate your leadership. It's great to continue to work with you. And anything that you need at the FCC, we're happy to help. So thank you again.
Appreciate it.
And thanks very much. And thank everyone for watching today. Thank you.
Thanks.